morning to everybody. I am Alessandra Venturini, the holder of the Jean Monnet Chair in European Migration Study. I'm very glad to open today the sixth lecture in the Mineu seminar. Mineu stands for Driver Migration in the Neighborhood of Europe. I'm very glad today we have the chance to have Matthias Lücke, who is a senior researcher at the Kiel Institute of World Economy. And he was also professor in Kiel, so he knows very well the area. He is an economist. He acts as a senior economist also for the World Bank, for International Monetary Fund. His research and teaching focus on migration, development, international trade, and European integration. Matthias Lücke is also coordinator of the MEDAN project, which is financed by the Mercator Foundation. MEDAN stands for Mercator Dialogue on Asylum and Migration. And the objective of this project is to consolidate research findings and policy analysis for implementation, for action implementation at European member state level, and also to lead the dialogue on activities with the stakeholder, both at the European and the national level. But I don't want to go on this and waste time. I give to you immediately the floor, Matthias. The floor is yours. Thanks again to accept our invitation.
Thank you very much, Professor Alessandra, and welcome to all participants in the seminar. I'm very happy to be sharing some thoughts with you on what is actually ongoing in the eastern neighborhood, the countries that you see on your map. If I can find my green light highlighter here. Basically, this group, this is what we will focus on. This is actually what I worked on before 2015, when the migration situation in Europe became so much more interesting. But I remembered as I was preparing this presentation that I really know a lot of details about these countries, and I will try to share some of the details to indicate what's going on. But I will also do my best not to lose sight of the forest for the trees. So let's get into the middle of things and let's see how this is working out. So yes, we will be focusing on Ukraine and Moldova quite a bit, but we will also consider the wider regional context. And one thing that I think is specific to the region to some extent, or at least it's more prominent in the region than in some others, is that you have very different patterns of migration. Which leads back to the question, how do we know about migration at all? What are our data sources? How can we figure out whether Moldova has 500,000 migrants abroad or 1 million? Because when you listen to the discourse in Moldova, some people will say, oh, it's 2 million, it's 1 million. You get sort of wild numbers on migration, which really indicates that it's important to be clear about what we mean when we talk about migration, what patterns there are, and that leads us back to how can we be more reasonable in establishing the facts about this. Then, of course, part of the discourse about migration in the countries of origin is that this is either good or bad or terrible for the countries, but one specific argument is that migration is bad because it raises people's wages, and that makes the countries less competitive. And this is like a Dutch disease, and this is all terrible. And I'm going to be discussing this a little because you might also think that when countries are very poor, like Ukraine and Moldova were after the Soviet Union disintegrated around 1990. So when countries are very poor, it's a good thing when people have higher wages, and it's not something to complain about. But as we will see, there is a bit of a discourse there, and we look at it. And of course, we also have to look, when we talk about Ukraine, at the current situation of Ukrainian refugees in the European Union. And I think this takes us back to many of the topics that you have been dealing with in your seminar so far. So we will be looking a little at the migration policy environment, if you like, for Ukrainian refugees, which is really the Temporary Protection Directive and how we will look at how it's applied in the EU and what this means as EU is now a candidate for EU membership. And I'm going to suggest that there should actually be free movement for Ukrainian workers in the European Union as part of the accession process. So what may become clear even from this brief introduction is that migration is part of a larger story. It's part of the story of how these countries and societies and economies are transforming from formerly being part of the Soviet Union, of a centrally planned economic system, and how they have come very close to integrating with the EU after about 30 years of a very haphazard and difficult and sometimes tragic transition that the people and the countries and the societies have gone through. So more specifically, I will start by just showing a few maps and to give an indication of where people are migrating, what the main migration corridors are. Then I'll show one slide that helps us to be a little systematic about how we think about the potential economic and social effects of emigration in the countries of origin. And then we will look at specifically Moldova to exemplify the issue of different migration patterns. How do you go from temporary to maybe permanent migration? What does that have to do with the destination countries? What does it have to do with legal regimes? How does it affect the country? And how do we learn about this from available data sources? Then we move on to Ukraine and jumped roughly to the year 2019 when migration to Poland had actually become a serious development after migration had been predominantly to Russia in earlier years. And we discussed some of these issues of what does emigration do to wages in the country, what does it do to the economic structure, maybe to the competitiveness of exports, because that is actually a discourse that is very prominent in a lot of these countries of origin. And finally, we talk briefly about where the refugees have gone and why, and what this means for sensible policies for the accession of Ukraine and for the people, for workers from Ukraine during the accession process. Okay, so here we go. And
Yes.
up to some maps. So this is the migration corridors in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, as you see. One thing you see is that a lot of migration is, of course, from poorer countries to richer countries. When you look at, say, a small place like Moldova, which is this place, you see people going to Russia, which is comparatively richer. You also see people going to Italy, which is also, of course, richer than Moldova. So per capita income is a big driver of migration here. You see a lot of movement from Central European countries also. This is Poland, this is Romania. You have Romanians going to Italy. You have Romanians going to Spain as well. Of course, quite a few people, especially from Poland, went to the UK, but also from the other smaller EU member states in Central Europe. But here is sort of the big movement from east to west. But when you look at this region, which is historically on the territory of the Soviet Union, you do see that the traditional relationships which existed with Russia also meant that quite a bit of migration actually happened in the direction of Russia. Now, it's been difficult to find up-to-date maps on this, but this period is actually the one when a lot of the migration from this region happened. When I started working on Moldova in the very early 2000s, migration was almost zero. We sort of found in the balance of payments when I was working for the IMF, we found an item called migrant remittances. And it took us sort of 5 minutes to figure out what it was because there was no talk about migration at that time. And in 5 or 10 years, migrant remittances became 1/3 of GDP, so everybody knew about it. So it's really during this time that a lot of things happened very fast. So even though it seems historic, it's not that historic. Just to remind us, there is all these other countries on the territory of the former Soviet Union. Here's Central Asia, and all these countries have a lot of immigrants in Russia, maybe with the exception of Kazakhstan, which is this large country here, which is oil rich. Azerbaijan, which is here, has now also a lot of incoming migration, but otherwise all these countries have a lot of migrants in Russia, which is still sort of the dominant country in the Eurasian region. And of course, these people are now in a difficult situation, but Russia continues to be quite open to attracting labor from this region. And maybe that has to do with the fact that a lot of Russian workers are tied up in the war in Ukraine. But this continues to be part of the larger scene of migration in Eastern Europe and beyond the Eurasian region, the territory of the former Soviet Union. Then one type of diagrams which you will very often see are these circular diagrams. And I think it's nice to sort of take a look at this because this one is geared towards the region that we are talking about. They define Western Europe as mainly the European Union. So this Western Europe in this case includes Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, basically because countries are in the EU. And these are the destination countries. Western Europe, Eastern Europe, that's basically former Soviet Union. Then Central Asia, that's the 5 Stan countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and the rest of the world. And what you can see here is that, of course, a lot of migration is within regions. These are the countries of origin. So a lot of migration is from the EU to the EU. That's prominent. There's also some migration from the rest of the world to the European Union. And then you have this flow from Southeastern Europe, which is mainly the Western Balkans, including Albania, to Western Europe. So, for example, the Albania to Italy migration corridor would be part of this yellow movement here. What else did I pick up? Oh, Romanians in Italy, they would be part of this flow from Western Europe, meaning the European Union, to Western Europe, including Italy. And Moldova to Italy would actually be here, Eastern Europe to Western Europe, this flow. So this is the way to read these circular diagrams. And one reason I'm showing this one is that it's really a nice way to capture all the movements that are going on and having a broad view of how important they are. Now, if this diagram had been done even more nicely, there would be a number here indicating how many migrants are represented by this segment of the circle. I guess it would have to be about 40 million, and then you know roughly how many are in all the other segments. But that's the way to look at this, and the way this diagram brings out the complexity of migration movements. I think that's very nice, and it's something that you will find in many representations of migration. Okay, having shown all these graphs, let's do a little systematic thinking and look at an overview table which I produced a long time ago, which I think is still helpful in making us think about what actually happens when people leave a country to go and work abroad. And this is really geared towards labor migration. It's not so relevant for countries which are basically undergoing a war and where it's difficult to have relations. But this is sort of the still more normal case of migration, I believe, when people leave in order to have more prosperous lives elsewhere. And this, of course, has been the dominant form of migration, labor migration, in the region that we care about. So the graph, the table has 4 quadrants, and what I'm trying to do is distinguish, first of all, the effects of people being absent. So this is workers moving abroad, and that has certain consequences. This is along this line. And then people don't just move abroad, but of course they send remittances, and that has a lot of effects, not just on the households that receive remittances, but also on the economies more broadly. So when we look at the effects of people moving abroad, let's do this first. It is actually important to think about some of the social effects that this may have. When you hear stories about migration from Moldova, you will often hear about mothers leaving their children behind, which was a big issue in the 2000s when female migrants in Italy tended to be irregular, which means they couldn't just go back for the holidays, for example, because going irregularly to Italy would have cost several thousand euros, and you can't just lose that by going home and to see your family. So these issues may be serious, and they actually play a big role in the discourse in those countries. Of course, there's also the simple issue of not having to feed the person who is there, which actually matters when you look at some household surveys and you wonder what's going on and whether households are actually better off. And you always need to remember, well, there is one mouth less to feed, which actually may make a difference when countries are quite poor. So there's the social cost, and let me just say one thing, because we did a lot of work on this. It does turn out, not surprisingly, that of course a lot of migrants migrate precisely in order to enable their children to have a better life. This is sometimes lost in the discourse, and it gets all about all the difficult things that happen when parents leave. Which is undoubted. But of course, if parents stay at home and live a precarious existence because their jobs are precarious and incomes are very low, that is not necessarily better. And when you sort of look at this systematically, you find that children with migrant parents tend to be better off in material terms. That's not surprising. But they also tend not to do worse in other terms. This is at least what we found when we looked at this quite systematically in Moldova. So these things are important, I think, because they dominate the discourse in the countries of origin. Now, when we think about economy-wide effects of the absence of people, there is, of course, the issue of brain drain, which you will have heard about. So I won't discuss it here in great detail. One thing that also matters in the transition economies that we are talking about is the fact that workers are leaving, which means that there is less pressure on the aggregate labor supply, and there is some upward pressure on wages. I mean, these countries had serious economic crises after the Soviet Union disintegrated. So there was, by any measure, a lot of unemployment, formal or informal, or people were not productively employed. And simply because a lot of people had a chance to leave and work elsewhere, that would have made the people better off who remained at home and basically could found it easier to find jobs in what remained of the economy. There's also the issue of not just the money that migrants transmit, but there's also the question, do they transmit attitudes as well? When, for example, when migrants went to Western Europe from Eastern Europe, they did experience more or less functioning democracies, at least in relative terms to where they came from. And there is some indication that this also played an important role in fostering political change in some countries. It doesn't necessarily have to be positive, but it certainly can be. Okay, so this is just an overview over what happens when people move abroad. Now let's look at what happens when they send money home. The first obvious thing is that the households that receive remittances are better off. And there is a wide literature demonstrating that poverty is reduced in those households. Households with migrants tend to experience less poverty, broadly speaking, than others. It may also be the case that credit constraints are reduced, so people can actually make larger investments. You may not be able to go to the bank and get a loan in order to set up a small firm or improve your farm. But if you get the money from relatives who are abroad, that may actually help you to do some investment that you couldn't do otherwise. Then these sort of the most important macroeconomic effect is indeed what has been in another world been described as the Dutch disease, and this runs like this. Of course, there is a lot of additional income. If there is a lot of remittances in an economy, there's a lot of additional income. And that income is going to be spent by households not only on imported goods, of course, some is spent on imports, and then it doesn't affect the domestic economy so much. But typically, if households grow a little less poor, they will also want to spend a lot of money on locally produced goods and services. And that creates demand for local labor, and that actually contributes to the recovery that we see in a lot of these countries that receive a lot of remittances. And that is actually quite important. So it's really not just the households that receive remittances that benefit, but typically it's also the rest of the economy because there is more demand, not only for imports, but there is also more demand for locally produced goods, and that helps local workers. Yes,
Just a
please.
this is not always the case. As you know, the Albania case is exactly the reverse, that remittances discourage the participation in the labor market so that small shops close and less participation in the labor market. You can risk it create a subsidized economy, that people live on remittances, they don't do small jobs, and so small shops close, and so on. So there can induce a reduction of the traditional activity, which is not replaced by other.
Yes, certainly there's a lot of debate, and there would be different experiences. But then I would sort of immediately ask, if people are better off not working, should we force them to work? I mean, not all work is good. If some people can withdraw from the labor market, and the ones who remain can then earn higher wages, I think that's fine as well. And I would sort of, in principle, I would trust the judgments that people make for themselves here. You could, of course, have an effect where people say, okay, I'll just live off the remittances. I don't need to go to school or something. But what we find is that um, much more than that, a lot of people do go to school because they can afford to, and they don't have
Yes.
to. They don't have to go. And I think we found it's at least as important for girls as for boys, and maybe more important.
No, but
And then,
the case of Albania is a special case also because
mm,
all the young has left. Only the old remained because half they came to Italy, half they went to Greece. And when Greece has the economic slowdown crisis, and many of them came back, this was positive for the economy. Being having more
mm.
population, more young population, they restarted to the activity that were abandoned during the departure because they had only old people and children and women, so all the activities were abandoned. They living on subsidies. But this is the drawback of small area where the majority of the young live.
Yes, and I think especially when you have the back and forth, then of course there is structural change, and when you've destroyed a structure in Albania, it may take time for people to go back and set up businesses and so on. So this is just an attempt to say these are the things that we need to think about when we think about the possible effects, and of course the direction of some of these effects, as Alessandra has pointed out, can go in different directions. But this is my attempt to summarize where we should be looking at. Now let me move on to Moldova, and the question then is indeed who is a migrant and how can we count them? And we'll see in a moment how this becomes very relevant when you actually try to understand what goes on in a country like Moldova. As you know, the most widely used definition is, of course, that a migrant is the resident of a country that is not their country of birth. And when you don't know about people's place of birth, sometimes you look at citizenship, depending on the kind of data you have. And then what data do we have in, say, in a country, if you imagine yourselves being responsible in government for planning schools, maybe investment in universities, investment in infrastructure, urban planning, spatial planning. So you want to know what is going to be the population, what is going to be the emigration from the regions that you are concerned with. So how do you actually learn about migration? And now the first thing you might think is, of course, people are obliged to go to the municipal office if they leave to go abroad, but people don't do that, we know. So administrative data are usually not very helpful. This is why we have censuses in a lot of countries. But that's very difficult. And censuses work by households. The unit is always the household. And who is actually a member of a household? Especially when would a migrant be considered a member of the household? Very often countries have a definition like, oh, a household is when people share at least one meal per day. Okay, sounds fine, but then when a migrant is abroad for 3 months or 6 months, they wouldn't be sharing meals, so they wouldn't even be counted. So they would never be listed in that census. So how do we know about them? Now, other countries like Moldova for quite a while had a much wider definition. So they would ask, well, who's contributing substantially to the financing of the household? Who's contributing to the income? Who's helping to decide what spending decisions are made? And then you may actually be able to count those migrants that still are in sort of permanent contact, who basically have a seat at the kitchen table, except they're not there for part of the year. So then you can count these people. So labor force surveys, for example, in many countries are one way to count migrants. But then if they leave for good, or if the whole household leaves for good, then you don't really find them. And then you have to look at country of destination data. But once again, it may take a lot of time for people to be properly registered in countries of destination, certainly in the context of the countries that we are talking about. So this may also not capture people that well. Then you can have issues with changing borders. A lot of Russian citizens today were born in Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine, but maybe never considered themselves Ukrainian. But when you simply look at the census of the country of destination, you may not actually see that. So it's a complicated picture. And let's look at Moldova to see how that is playing out and what the story is. This is relatively straightforward. This is the labor force survey of Moldova, and they sort of have this question: if somebody is abroad but still considered a member of the household, which means they contribute to the funding, to the financing, and they help to make the decisions and so on. And then you find that okay, there were about 300,000 people in Russia at this time, mid 2010s, and various people in the EU, say about 100,000 here, quite a few in Italy. And this comes to a total which is like 400,000 migrants. And that's probably sort of realistic. I mean, these are the people who were found by the labor force survey. So they are probably in some sense part of the picture for the Moldovan economy. Now, when you look at other data, especially destination country data, sort of national sources, which are aggregated by Eurostat, you find that the number of people in the European Union is much larger than in the labor force survey. And this, of course, has to do with Italy, which had about 150,000 Moldovans in the mid-2010s, as opposed to 60,000 who were in the labor force survey. And this goes on for a lot of other countries. So if you add it all up, you end up with more than 700,000 migrants. And that actually makes a difference when you have a country of 2.6 million people. Then whether you have 400,000 people abroad or 700,000 actually matters. And the point is that if you just look at the labor force survey, you would have missed all these people, roughly 150,000 in Italy, where the story, of course, is that these people lived in Italy for a long time, and then they were regularized, and then they began to bring their families. So instead of being temporary migrant, essentially temporary migrants in the sense of belonging to a household, they became permanent migrants. So they are in Italy for good, and they will stay there. Another country which is interesting is Romania, which has 80,000 people listed from destination country sources, and the Moldovan labor force survey just has a few. And of course, part of the story is that Moldovans were able to get Romanian passports. So a lot basically left and lived in Romania, but they didn't tell their authorities back home, and the whole household, the whole family will have gone. So there was nobody left to tell them, to tell the interviewers from the statistics office about these migrants abroad. So this is, I'm showing this to give an example of how to approach this very nuanced issue of migration, where you have different patterns interacting. And maybe let's just start to look very quickly at the story of migration from Moldova, to put this all in a little bit of a context. Migration is very much an issue that has to do with the systemic transformation of Moldova. Moldova is a very agricultural country, which meant it was doing quite well under the Soviet Union. But then there was a lot of restructuring, there was a lot of rural to urban migration. Agriculture under market conditions did much worse. And rural to urban migration really meant that people were going to Moscow and St. Petersburg in the first instance, because they could legally go there, they could get jobs. There was a construction industry that was actually booming at that time. So here you have that aspect of structural change tied up with the history of the country as part of the Soviet Union. And initially, of course, most of these migrants would remain members of a household in Moldova. And then emerged two large groups of migrants. One is men, who tended to be young to middle-aged, from rural areas very often, with low to medium levels of education. And they went to Russia to work in the construction industry. And then you had quite a few women who tended to be from smaller cities, tended to be middle-aged or even older, were experienced caregivers in their own families. And a lot of these went to Italy in the first instance. And you may know these stories. There were caregivers in private households. There was a lot of informal work. And gradually, they became regularized, as I said a moment ago. And this is what we found in the data. Migrant remittances were up to 1/3 of GDP in the 2000s, actually. And they are now down to a much lower relative amount. They're still higher in absolute terms, but in relative times, they're lower. Sorry, did you want to intervene, Alessandra?
This is an incredible amount. And
This is
Ukraine.
incredible. It's a small country. It's a small country, and therefore the amount is so incredible. And more than 20% as at present is still quite high. So Moldova is a bit exceptional, and you find it along with Tajikistan or so in these relative terms. But that's what we have. Now, of course, later, what happened was not only that Moldovans became regularized in Italy and a lot became EU citizens through their Romanian passports, but there's also visa liberalization for Moldovan citizens in the EU, and they can work informally in the EU. In fact, they do. It may or may not be legal, but they do. And Moldova has become a candidate for EU membership. So it's been a long transition, but it's continuing, and it's continuing towards Western Europe, I would say. Now, with one eye to the clock, I would quickly jump to Ukraine, where some of the developments are not that dissimilar. And what was more pronounced in Ukraine was that the economic linkages with Russia were, of course, very strong, especially until about 2014. This had to do with trade, value chains, energy prices. Ukraine for some time used to get Russian natural gas at reduced prices compared to the world market. Populations are quite intermingled. And what brought things to a head, sort of, was the association agreement with the EU in 2014, which sort of created a more formal process for growing integration of Ukraine with Western Europe, and the Russian invasion of Crimea and parts of the Donbas, which basically led to a low-scale war, which continued throughout all these years until the Russian invasion of last year. Around 2014, what really happened was the emigration to Poland took off in a big way. So Poland, in many ways, replaced Russia as the main destination country for Ukrainian migrants. Trade integration with the EU took off in a big way. Most of Ukraine's trade is now with the EU, same for Moldova. And visa liberalization for Ukrainian citizens with the EU was a big thing because Ukrainians can freely travel in the EU since then. And informally, I guess, quite a few managed to work also in the EU. Now, here's a table which is very similar to the Moldovan table that we had before. And you can see some of the changes that were going on between the early 2010s and then a few years after the invasion. One thing I would point out is just this number, which is people born in Ukraine who live in Russia or who lived in Russia at that time. And of course, many of these would have been Soviet citizens who never thought of themselves specifically as either Russian or Ukrainian, but were just Soviet citizens, and then suddenly the borders became more important, and they ended up as migrants in these statistics. So when you look at the United Nations data, basically don't trust them when it's about the Soviet Union, because many of these people would never have considered themselves Ukrainian migrants in Russia. Otherwise, we see the same issues from the labor force survey as before, except it seems to be a little more relevant, and a little more relevant. Even Poland is picked up quite well, the increase in migration to Poland after 2015, roughly. And that has been the big thing. You see at more realistic numbers, you see the number of migrants in Russia going down from 500,000 to 300,000 in 2017. And you see an increase in migration to the EU at the same time. Yes, Alessandra, please.
Yes, I think with Poland, Ukraine has a special legislation that allows the free mobility for 3 months, no?
Yes,
So
I think I'll get to this in a second. It's a kind of a complex. It's basically a very liberal way of saying, oh, you employers just employ as many Ukrainians as you like. So they had a way of not even giving. I think you needed sort of a sheet from an employer saying, "Oh, this is the person I want," but they never sort of gave proper visa to the individual Ukrainian workers. But it was at the employer level, and it was very liberal. It was the same for other countries of the former Soviet Union, and that really helped. I think this always existed, but it somehow it became much more widespread from about 2015. And of course that means it's very hard to tell how many people are really involved. You may know the number of permits that have been issued to employers, but then employers may not actually hire somebody. You don't really know. And there were some funny games going on. And then you don't know whether there is a certain number of permits on average over the year. You don't really know whether this is the same person or it's different people over the year. It may be different people. So there may be a lot of more short-term migration going on, and a lot more people may actually benefit from migration than may be apparent if you just look at the number. And that is a familiar problem, but it's quite prominent here. So what they figured out, the central bank was very interested in this in sort of around 2019, the Central Bank of Poland, because they wanted to estimate their GDP and balance of payments, and they thought, okay, all these Ukrainians, what are they doing? What are they earning? What are they producing? And they figured basically that there were between 1 and 2 million Ukrainians, depending on how you looked at it. And what is clear is that this has been a big movement, and this has been part of the integration of Ukraine um, with European Union countries. Now, here's the remittances, which is, of course, lower than in Moldova because Ukraine is a much larger country. In terms of GDP, we were talking about 8 to 9% in 2018, and this roughly stayed this way. In absolute terms, this has gone up to $12 billion or so. And what you can also see from this is that these are notoriously difficult to estimate. The numbers used to be always much lower here. This is percent of GDP. So the unrevised theory is way lower than what they got after they did a careful revision. Because people often people just take cash back home. So it's kind of difficult to measure how much cash they take. Maybe you can figure out from the turnover of exchange offices what's going on, but it's kind of difficult to figure out. And what you can also see from this graph is that the share of Russia in remittances had been declining a lot already in 2018, and of course it would be close to zero now, and Poland especially. This is Poland. Poland has taken off as a source of remittances.
Sorry, sorry. Do you think that the large migration of Ukraine to the European country has changed the attitude of peoples versus Russia? And this is, in a certain way, one of the roots of the reaction of Ukraine to invasion of Russia. Because, for instance, I knew many students, not in Italy, but they were in Switzerland and in the north. They are Ukrainian, and they wanted to be Russian in a certain way. For a long time, for the Ukrainian, being Russian was a plus, not a minus. And you don't think that behind this change of position of the Ukrainian citizen, there is also the openness that migration has introduced in the vision of the experience that I had in European countries, because in Italy, for instance, the large migration of Ukrainian in Italy is due to the Polish. So the Polish came during the Pope, when we had the Polish Pope. And they want to go to the United States, but they came in Italy because it was the only way to exit from Poland. And the Ukrainian, having the free mobility with Poland, replace them. And because the women are doing the caregiver, the majority are female migrants, and but they had organized with buses, so they were going back, bringing back their remittance, bring back value. So they were transmitting the culture and the freedom of these countries. I tell you the experience of Italy because the one that I know more, but I think they were in all the country, in Portugal even, that is so far as is questioning why they went to Portugal, and so on. But there was a chain, the chain was behind this. And I was wondering why, if migration is playing a role, so the culture openness experience that was represented by migration is behind this Ukrainian feeling more European than Russian.
I think there are some historian might be better placed to sort of dig into what happened first. Of course, 2015, the annexation of Crimea and the Russian war in the Donbas happened before this migration really turned around, and before economic integration really turned around. So and then of course Russia became a much more dictatorial state, and basically a lot
Yes,
more
aggressive, yes.
a much more fascist state than it was in 2015. We may have had illusions, but Russia simply didn't look so bad in 2013. And
Yes.
the invasion of Crimea was I think a shock to many, and the low scale war which then continued was more noted by some than by others, but there we go.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I've explained the issue of why local wages may increase when you have remittances coming in, and I also pointed out that when you have a country that is in the middle of a transformation crisis, having some people leave and allowing the others to find better jobs and be better paid may actually be a good thing. And just to illustrate this, I have two graphs. This is Eastern Partnership countries from 2000 to 2010, which is sort of nice because the IFS, International Financial Statistics, at the time had those data, and they don't any longer. And we will talk about Ukraine after, which we have Ukraine until almost 2020. So what you see is basically real wages going up massively in all these countries, which all had massive economic crises as a result of the disintegrating Soviet Union. And of course, lots of things happened at the same time. That's very clear. But I think it's sort of it was basically good news for these people that they weren't earning 50 euros per month, or is it dollars, $50 per month, but something between 200 and $300 per month. And this has gone up a little further. And also this is in constant value dollars. So today it would be worth a little more. So this recovery, the question is, how could it happen in a country like Moldova, where there was very little internal investment, where agriculture really needed to be restructured completely? And I just fail to see, I cannot see how this could have happened without a lot of people leaving those countries and no longer looking for jobs there. And also without the extra demand for locally produced goods and services that was funded by remittances. I think this just must have been a big part of the story, even though it will be difficult to identify all the various causes that may have contributed. But migration and remittances was a big topic in these countries. And I just fail to see how it could not have been part of this story. Now, continuing Ukraine, we've reached the year 2010 or so. You see there's a lot of going on, a lot of ups and downs here, and real wages in terms of domestic currency deflated by domestic inflation have sort of continued to increase, even though maybe a little less rapidly than before. But what you also see is what foreign investors are concerned about, what exporters would be concerned about, is the wage measured in dollars, and the relevant line is the solid blue line here. And you see that because the Ukrainian currency devalued somewhat following the war in 2000, well, following the crisis in 2013 and then the war, and stayed low. It's really not the case that wages in Ukraine have climbed to impossible heights. And this was interesting because we were there in 2019 and discussing with foreign investors and some domestic firms as well, and everybody was complaining about high wages, and they probably looked at this increase, sort of this last bit here over the last 3 years, and said, "Oh, this is impossibly high," but actually they had the same level of wages before. And I put this down to a lot of industry lobbyists complaining about high wages, which is part of life, but not something that we as economists should take at face value. What I found a little more shocking was that the same argument was rehearsed by IMF economists when I was reading the paper, which I cite when I present the maps. So there's also this talk about declining competitiveness, and yes, of course. I mean, if wages in dollars increase, you have to become more productive as well. I mean that's clear enough. But then, when wages are $300 or $400, $500 per month, to talk about impossible conditions for exports, I think is a bit of a stretch. I mean, we're talking about European countries with a price level that is not so dissimilar from, not so different from what we have in Western Europe. I was always shocked by the prices in Chisinau when I was there. I mean, they were, say, 70% of what they were in Kiel, in my hometown, for food, for example. But then people were earning a fraction of what I was earning. So the idea that higher wages because of migration and remittances are a bad thing, I think that's simply wrong when you look at a poor country where higher incomes are basically a good thing. And this is why I think the story is more positive than some people make it out to be. I have something popping up about my next meeting, so I will jump to the next slide, if I may.
Yes, please.
And just say, what does this mean now that we have the refugee situation? And of course, a lot of this is the total number of refugees from Ukraine. And of course, a lot of people who've gone to Russia may not have gone there voluntarily, and this is in the footnote. So this is this long bar for Russia. But then you see that a lot of the refugees are in places where they have networks. That's Poland, that's Czech Republic, and a lot are also in countries where the networks may not be so strong, but social services are relatively solid. So that does seem to play a role for Germany. So we're getting some people who may have sick children or maybe in circumstances where they cannot easily find work, and then going to Germany and receiving a basic income is maybe easier than trying to survive in other West European countries. Now, when you look at per capita Ukrainian refugees sort of per population, then of course the smaller countries in Europe have far higher percentages. Up to Moldova, which is 3.5%, and going up for countries like Estonia. Germany is all the way down at a little more than 1% of the population. And I don't even see Italy here, but here's Italy. Okay, 200,000. I guess that indicates that integration is a challenge, even though it's going well, but integration may be a challenge when you suddenly have an increase in 4% of a population increase of 4%. while sort of the big picture is people go where the networks are and where the jobs are.
Sure.
This is what I summarized here. Now, in policy terms, of course, now we have the Temporary Protection Directive, which sort of follows on from visa liberalization. People are free to go to any EU country that they want to go to. This TPD, Temporary Protection Directive framework, works for a maximum of 3 years, and the big question is what comes afterwards. Do we ask all the Ukrainian refugees to go home, or do we channel them through some sort of asylum procedure? I don't think any of this makes much sense. And looking forward, I think the way to go would be to grant freedom of movement to Ukrainian citizens, just like to any other EU citizens, given that the Ukraine is on the way of accession to the EU, although that may take a little longer. And that would actually be an interesting way of completing the process from being a country on the territory of the former Soviet Union to integrating with the EU, which is sort of where most of Europe is, and where opportunities for development do seem to be best. And migration has been a big part of this. Forced migration lately, but voluntary migration before has been a big part of that picture. So let me conclude here and maybe answer a few questions.
Yes, thank you.
Then run to my next meeting.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very broad presentation. I wonder if you have any questions. So for the question that is a temporary directive lasts for 3 years, but has the Commission forecasted something for a long-term process, or is just hoping that the war will finish and the reconstruction will start?
I think they were quite happy to have settled on 3 years for the time being, and this is until 2025. So it's not bad, frankly speaking. But I think the thinking about what's going to happen in 2025 is only if it's beginning, it's only just beginning. And maybe I hear more and more people saying let's think about it, and let's think about how we can implement free movement for them. So there isn't a sudden break, which wouldn't make any sense for anybody. In the meantime, what we hear about labor market integration and integration into education systems is very positive.
Yes, but do you think that Ukrainian migrants consider themselves temporary migrants, or they work for a more long-term investment, like the Syrian, like the Afghani, like the other asylum seeker in the destination country?
I think when you ask them, the surveys say that quite a lot of them say they would want to return to Ukraine if they can. But very, very obviously that depends on how the war continues and how it ends, and what is going to be left of Ukraine. There's also a lot of people saying, unless there is a free Ukraine, I'm not going back. Not very many people would go back if there were sort of lack of security, for example. How do you get security? Well, if Ukraine becomes a NATO country, yes. But is that on the cards? We don't know yet. So the way for people to react may well be to say, well, until it's safe, I'm not sending my kids back to a situation where there could be another war in 3 years' time or 5 years' time.
Yes, we see Europe that in the north is more affected by the eastern neighborhood. In the south is more affected by the southern neighborhood. So the quality of migration, the problem of migration is very different. And it's difficult for the European Union to find an agreement on the policy to adopt versus the asylum seeker. Could you comment? If they will find a solution to adjust?
I'm frankly not very optimistic. I think what the new pact on migration, asylum and migration tries to do is to sort of pull everything together, like everybody has to cooperate and everybody has to trust everybody. and there are too many countries that think they can play games and, for example, not come up with the necessary solidarity or not come up with the necessary registration of migrants. So I think it's going to be a stretch, and what seems to be happening is that the conditions on the external borders are really quite terrible with all the pushbacks and what's happening in the Mediterranean. But I don't really see that improving because everybody sort of knows that if that were to improve, then more irregular migrants would be coming, and then we would need proper procedures to deal with these irregular migrants, and we don't have the mutual trust among EU member states to make that effective. That's my somewhat pessimistic assessment here.
No, but the case of Poland is very clear. Poland was considering closing the border as soon as the
Mm.
Ukrainian were in trouble. They opened the border, and we are all very happy that they have done this. But it's an ad hoc policy. It's not a European policy.
Yes, and I think, I mean, the EU has been incredibly lucky that Ukrainians went where they have networks and where they can work, and so many went to Poland, and that made it so much easier for everybody else to host those
Yes.
Ukrainians that were coming to them. I mean, I think they say there's more Ukrainians in Germany now than there were Syrians, and we don't see as nearly as much about it because integration is going so smoothly, but it's still costing a lot of money. And if there were twice as many, we would be facing problems. Now we are, I guess, institutions, schools, hospitals, places of work are coping very well.
In a certain way, they are more easier to integrate because they were already many of them workers, so coming for work they accept as worker. The average human capital is higher than the one, or at least the cultural difference between other communities is smaller, and this makes them much easier to integrate and to have a different attitude versus them in comparison to the versus other community, which need anyhow protection because are asylum seeker as
Mm.
Ukrainian. So
I
I try to
agree.
inquire if there are other questions. No, I think that. Quando lui ha detto significa che i dati però sono molto rilevanti perché la Moldavia ha 2-3 milioni, inclusa la diaspora di cittadini, e quindi in realtà sono esclusivamente quei tipi di lavori, seppur stereotipizzati, che incidono. È logico che la diplomazia e le poche elite che ci sono non ne contano. Comunque è preoccupante perché significa che praticamente 3/3 della popolazione moldava sono dispiegati o in Italia o comunque yes, può apprezzato molto. I translate the comment. The comment was that he was very impressed. The student said that he was very impressed by the presentation that you did on the Moldovan migrant. That is a large share of the population is in Europe doing this type of work, and this is important also for the country that live on remittances, and this is not a sustaining policy for a country, live on remittances. Okay. So, Matthias, thank you very much. We know that you have another meeting, and if my student has some question which is not answered by your slide or your presentation, the reading that you suggest is a chapter of the Medan report, I guess, or I'm wrong.
That's right, and that's the focus on that would be on the Ukrainian refugee situation, and I can go back and find other readings on the other material I covered.
Okay, thank you very much. I will send you the recorded presentation before putting them on the web. Thank you
Perfect.
very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody.
Thank you very much from
Yeah,
my
bye-bye.
side. All the students are online on here.
Thank
Ciao.
you to everybody.